Okay, everybody, welcome back to Programming Foundations 1. So this is a slight update from the last several classes. So the slides have changed a little bit. The stuff on FSO have also changed. So I'll be noting different things here and there as we go through the administrative stuff of this first lecture. So bear with me as I go through that. So again, welcome to Programming Foundations 1. So I'm your instructor for this course, Tony Reynolds. I've got a little over a decade's worth of experience in the game industry, simulation industry. Been working with Unity for several years now. So chances are, if you run into any issues with it, just questions, comments, thoughts on the industry, you want opinions, that kind of stuff, hit me up. To my left is Justin and Dan, also very experienced, able to answer pretty much any questions you throw at us. The environment for this particular class that we're going to be working in, you should be in Windows. If you're not, you need to switch over. We're going to be, despite what one of the documents in the FSO thing says, we're not using Unity 5.6 or whatever. Just try to stick with the latest one. In this case, as of October 12th, it's Unity 2017-20F3. And will be in Visual Studio. If you happen to run into the scenario where in past classes you picked up Visual Studio Enterprise from the On the Hub thing and you're receiving the message your trial has expired, that key that it's asking for should be in your On the Hub receipt from when you downloaded it. Otherwise, go back to On the Hub, download it, get yourself another key, etc. Should be perfectly fine. Get that knocked out early. So the idea here is I've got a number of slides that cover some stuff. I've also got some code that we'll be writing and kind of reviewing, and then I've also got some stuff on FSO that we'll take a look at. So the lecture slides here compared to the stuff that's on FSO and stuff you've read in the past has changed. It's been updated in different ways. Some of it may look the same. Other things have changed or been completely retooled. So if you're in the scenario where you're looking for some kind of answer for what's going on, chances are we've got it covered in one of the videos. The weekly videos have been broken out so that they're like by kind of by context, so that you can understand like these 3 videos are days 1, 2, and 3 for the first week and so on. So just throw that into YouTube, maybe flick on the 2 times speed and burn through it if you're looking for a specific thing that we cover. So like I said, we pretty much cover everything that you need to pass this class. There are, with the week 2 and the week 3 projects, there's what we show you will get you to about an 80 or a 75 depending on the project. It's a passing grade, but then there's extra stuff that you are expected to go out and like research on your own and add features and bolster your project, make it look a little better, a little different, that kind of stuff. So the way this class is generally flowing is I've got a number of slides with examples and some discussion concepts, and that's mainly the theory side of it, like what these things are, why they exist, where they exist, and how to properly use them, things to look out for. Then we have practical, where we actually jump into Unity and Visual Studio, and we actually see this stuff live. We're looking at some of the errors. We're looking at how the syntax and where these things live, how they talk to each other, what the visibility on certain things is and why that's a thing. So real quick, we can take a quick glance over the stuff on FSO. If you go looking through here, this top contact information, live lectures, and support, going down through this list, you'll see there's a number of links in here. Right here at the very top, contact information availability is in my FSO profile. From your page, you should be able to hit the instructor's profile. My Skype information's in there, so on and so forth. The live lectures, this is mainly for the guys who are watching this who are remote. You can actually link into our to the session that's being recorded right now just by registering there. The lectures that I'm currently recording are actually going to be uploaded to a YouTube playlist. Right now it's empty because there's nothing recorded just yet. But if you wanted to go back and take a look at kind of what we worked with last month, and again, this month is a slight modification of it, but a lot of the information is still very relevant, you can take a look at this October lectures playlist and kind of scroll through and take a look at the general flow of the class as Justin taught it. Additionally, throughout the week, there's this Unity Open Lab. It's actually ULab because it supports both Unreal and Unity. So if you're having an issue and maybe your assignment's upcoming and you want some extra help or just to kind of listen to other people's problems and their solutions, then that's a great asset for you to jump into. Even though it says it's not updated just yet, it should be updated shortly, so keep an eye on that. Generally speaking, keep an eye on your FSO messages, announcements, any kind of date changes. Like, for example, when we ran into Irma, we had all kinds of exceptions being thrown around because we were allowing people impacted to turn in things late or whatever. Keep an eye on those kinds of announcements because that's where that information gets posted. Okay, so as we go looking through this first little section, it's basically pretty much as it says. There's a couple of quizzes on here to sort out your professionalism, that kind of stuff, and then the course setup. The course setup and course introduction to Unity setup, it's asking you to basically show us that you've got both Unity and Visual Studio installed and they can talk to each other so that you can actually do these assignments. That's the assignment, by the way, that tells you Unity 5.6. Some things have been modified, so that's no longer really an issue. If you happen to be working with one of your older installs, you should still be able to work with it, but it's just generally recommended. Like, there's been a lot of fixes, some security patches, that kind of stuff with Unity just in general. Get the latest bells, whistles, features, etc. So you can jump to that if you are so inclined. Each one of these weekly video lists that we had before, it's been modified this time around to link directly to that previous month's lecture, but to which day. So you can kind of figure out where we're going for the first week, second week, third week. The lectures that I'm doing will mimic a lot of that content, but it'll be slightly different. Okay, and as we continue through the various days throughout the course, these individual tests, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, as each day concludes, you should have enough information to be able to jump in and do that particular test. But notice the due dates on them aren't until the end of the week or middle of or beginning of next week, that kind of deal. So you should be able to, if there's something you don't know the answer to at that exact moment, you can always jump back and, when day 3 concludes, you'll be able to see, oh, well, that was the answer to whichever test question or, so on and so forth. The turn-in test down here, it's a pass-fail. There's only like 5 or 7 questions. A couple of them we actually do here in class, so they're kind of freebies. But the rest of them, it's as simple as reading what is right there in front of you and looking up the answer based on the lectures and the slides and that kind of stuff. So it's, all of our tests, they're open book, so you should have access to all the information you need. The exercises, they are strictly for you to experiment with because as we go forward, several of the other projects use similar things that were shown or experimented with inside the exercises. The exercises themselves aren't for turn-in. We don't grade them in any way. They are strictly just for practice. But they're very useful in terms of showing you and getting practice with the different ins and outs. And those are the things that you can really run into issues with and then ask, what am I doing wrong here? Or I'm just not noticing that one curly bracket out of place or that one double quote somewhere that's just missing. As we break into week 2, we have more videos, more exercises, and then the actual text adventure project. You have a couple of different ones that you can choose from. a Alice in Wonderland kind of curiouser game, or a like a horror house kind of thing, Desert Escape. And you'll be taking a lot of the concepts that we go through up to that point and tuning them from what you would have seen in the exercises as well as in class into what either of those two stories that you pick, and using those to complete it, to add functionality, etc. Week 3 will break out into an Arkanoid clone, but it's slightly different than it has been in the past. If you were here months ago, the videos and the lecture, the rubric's basically unchanged, but the videos, the download that's on this project, the Unity package that's part of the install, and the idea is like you would use the content in there, no longer exists. The idea is we want you guys to be able to jump into Unity and from soup to nuts, from scratch, be able to construct this stuff, not relying on being able to access the asset store, being able to access somebody else's packages elsewhere to construct something. So in both the lecture videos that are part of that week 3 video, as well as the stuff that I'll be going through this month, it's basically you start from a completely blank Unity project and construct from there. And as long as you follow along with what I'm doing, then it's either a 75 or an 85 or an 80, one of the two, which again is passing. So it meets all the requirements of the basic section of the rubric, and you should be good from there. But there's an advanced and an intermediate section right after that you can add. You can research and add additional features if you so desired. And then as we approach the end of the month, we get into a couple of finals, and so those just pretty much wrap up everything we've done up to that point. We've covered up to that point, and we'll probably do reviews going up to that. So any questions, comments, concerns you have throughout the course of the lecture, any kind of errors that you detect here, or any issues you're running into in code or in Unity, it's behaving oddly, why is it doing this? Chances are the person next to you might have those same questions. So you can usually kind of team up, but avoid giving each other the answers. But the idea is somebody else in class might have run into that exact same problem. So, be the courageous one. Throw your hand up and say, hey, what's wrong with this particular thing? My code looks the same, but it's acting a little different. Well, chances are there's like one little thing out of place. This code, as you'll see, is case sensitive. The spelling, the words absolutely matter. There are certain ones that are registered keywords with the system, and so if you accidentally reuse one of those, the syntax highlighting in Visual Studio is going to show you that something's a little off. It'll change colors. And so when we go through and we're seeing the code both written and what it is understood as in Unity, you'll see some of these errors and some of these warnings pop up. So the idea is to be alert, have your attention to detail glasses turned on so that you're watching out for these things, because the programs that we're working in, they'll tell you usually what's going on. And in a lot of cases, they'll actually put you right at the heart of the problem within a line or two. And so you'll see that shortly. Okay, like I said, ask questions early and often. If you're in here from a past class, basically to succeed at this and to not be potentially dinged with self-plagiarism, if you're turning in the same thing, graded or otherwise, from a past class, assuming you were in here before, modify it in some way, please. It will basically save you from being dinged with self-plagiarism. You can add extra features. You can modify the way your code works, modify some of the scenes, so on and so forth. If it wasn't working the first time around, get it working this time. It's your second chance. If it was working, modify it in some way. View all of our content, because some of that stuff has changed. The lecture material, the videos recording the slides here and whatnot. So it's been updated. Do additional research outside if you're looking to experiment with some of these extra features, or something is just not making sense. There are, and the next slide, I believe, has some resources I'll show you that you can jump out to help you above and beyond just the stuff in this class. don't cheat. It should be obvious. Or don't blindly charge into assignments. This is the whole, the stuff has possibly changed, so don't assume that it's exactly the same as it was before, because again, we can also detect for like self-plagiarism, and it's an unfortunate thing, but you'll both get a 0 on the assignment and professionalism, and it'll be reported. So just don't do it. The idea is you're paying to learn, so actively do it. Don't try to look out there on the web or in the asset store for ready-made templates for this kind of stuff, because we know it exists. It's not that difficult to spot this stuff. So, you guys are paying several, tens of thousands of dollars to do this, your time, your effort, your life, to blow it all away, to potentially risk it all for like a $3 asset. Yeah, bad choice. So, we're giving you this information. Please engage with us, ask us, because you do this stuff in a professional setting, out there in the industry, the consequences are much more severe. They take that stuff very seriously. So just, avoid it. And like I said earlier, when in doubt, err on the side of caution. Ask questions. We'll be more than happy to sort it out or give you guidelines or recommendations or whatever. So as I mentioned before, FSO, it's messages, it's announcements, it's dates. That's where pretty much all of our communication is going to be channeled through. Yes, we will respond to Skype. Yes, we will respond to direct emails should you send those. But FSO is usually the quickest way. Yeah. So as this course progresses on, not just this class, but the rest of the course in general, you're going to run into situations where something we've taught you or something you've been asked to research may not initially make sense. The Unity engine has a lot of stuff built into it. It's deceptively complex. It hides a bunch of stuff, but to know what that stuff is, you would have, run through tutorials and samples. Unity posts a lot of this stuff. Running through their documentation, seeing other tutorials out there, seeing how people do this kind of stuff. So the first, assuming you're wanting more information or you're running into issues where you're like, well, I remember he talked about this if statement in class or these variables or whatever, but maybe I need a little bit more information and maybe they're not responding or whatever. So the number one link that I'll send you to right off the bat is off of Unity's main website, unity3d.com/learn/tutorials. There and there. And if you scroll down on this page, you'll see there's a number of projects so that you can experiment with some other stuff if you're just generally curious, research above and beyond the scope of the class. But if you scroll down, you'll notice there are these subsections of just general topics. Now, the two big ones that you guys will want to look at if you're running into any kind of issues, both on the scripting side or both on the Unity side, how do I interface with this thing above and beyond what's been taught in class or as a reinforcement of that, is the interface and essentials and the scripting. If you pull up either of those two and just scroll down, you'll get small snippet videos, maybe 5 to 10 minutes long. Some of these things will actually have code blocks to show you here are alternative things. Like in this class, we've got a lot of content to go through, not a lot of time to do it, but there's other things that both the C# language, the .NET framework, Unity provides for you that you may see pop up here or there that it's like, oh, I don't know what that was. I want more information on it. Well, those things exist here, and if you go over to the scripting page, you'll notice looking down through, you'll get all kinds of information. Chances are, whatever it is you're looking for later on when we go through properties, well, there's a section right here on properties. So there's a little bit more information there that can supplement what you're dealing with now. Just for example, loops, right? You go looking through here and there's a quick little video on it, but then there's also sample code just below that to show you how if you're having an issue or you just want to see a slightly different version of it, you can reference these bits of code to see how the proper syntax looks, how it should look. The next one, this link actually will be more useful as the week 3 stuff kind of starts to happen, as well as future classes, to kind of get a better understanding of how Unity differs from like some of these other tutorials and how it generally operates from a coding standpoint. The reason I'm going to show you this is because when you're out there looking around for like why is my code not working? What's this thing or whatever? A lot of this stuff, a lot of the like Head Start or C# primer or various books, various links that you'll find, they're written from a native C# standpoint, meaning you're going to see stuff like main. And Unity doesn't do that. Unity works, and you'll see it here in just a minute, with the concept of start and update. It's how the bigger overall architecture of that engine functions. Something stripped down to be like a native C# application is just one single entry point. Unity has all kinds of other bells and whistles and systems actively doing things. So you're going to want to kind of have a little bit of like heads up, insight, foresight into how Unity is actually executing itself from like when it very first starts up. When you hit the play button, what's it doing? Versus, this is all my startup code versus this is the code that's happening every single frame. So you can see that, and you can also, again, as the course progresses on, you'll be able to see, oh, there are all these other things that I could potentially research into, take advantage of, get notifications from the engine as far as other, other events and that kind of stuff that you can basically bend to your will, because this engine is powerful, but not knowing that feature's in there doesn't really help you. So you can take a look. The second link comes right off the documentation. So just to go back one step, these from the main Unity website, learn, across here, the second little subheading thing, there are a number of other references you could look at, including documentation. And if you go over to the documentation, you have both the manual for the engine itself as well as scripting API. Chances are anything you run into, what's this method do? What's this word mean? You can Google that word or that little snippet of code, and you'll probably, if it's close enough to what's in here, you'll probably get an immediate hit on the scripting API. So you can go in here and scroll down and look at some of those snippets and realize, oh, well, this is probably what I should have done, or here's how I can modify my code to take advantage of this other thing. So it's definitely one of those, it's not a Pandora's box, but it's got a lot of stuff in it. So initially it can feel very daunting, overwhelming, but just, take a step back, breathe. The idea of, the master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried, that kind of mentality. We've been doing stuff like this even before Unity, just in different kinds of engines, proprietary and otherwise. So once you start seeing this stuff live in this engine, you can start to notice similarities in other engines like Unreal and Lumberyard and so on and so forth. So this particular link, the execution order, if you scroll down, you'll notice there's these bold words and a little description as far as what's going on. Now, I don't expect you to understand any of this at the moment, but this is a reference you can go back to periodically, because here in just a moment when we get into actual code, you're going to see start and update. You'll think, well, what's this? I'll describe it, but if you want more information about when these are executed, what in the Unity startup pipeline is actually going on, as you scroll down through this page, you'll come to this nifty little graphic down here at the bottom. It's basically a flowchart of Unity's internal execution and how it calls out to your whatever it is you've possibly taken advantage of over there in your code. So, for example, right here, when we go into initialization, we've got start. If you scroll down a little bit, down here inside the game logic, we've got update. So we won't be going into too many more bits and pieces of the core engine, but just so you know, they are there. You can read up on some of this other stuff and take advantage. And if you see this stuff in other tutorials out there or Unity's official tutorials, this is one of those references, one of those resources that you can jump back to see, oh, here's a little snippet, here's a little snippet of code, here's what this all means in context. So you can build a much bigger picture in your mind of what's going on with Unity. You can experiment with it and go from there. Okay? So I've been asked before for like slide shows, cards, like a little flashcards, that kind of stuff, of the things we'll be covering in Unity, or in this class, in both Unity and C#. Now, we kind of jump around. We cover a lot of different things. It's all right there in the code that we're writing and recording. But the idea is to have just a little bit more information on what it is, whatever it is you're looking at. What does this 2-letter versus 3-letter if versus for? What are they? What do they mean? Why did the color change when I wrote it in code? So in addition to the tutorials, the Unity tutorials link that I just showed you, there's the actual C# guide that Microsoft publishes. So I used a quick little link shortener here. So it's O, capital U, capital W, M, 2, and then capital P. But if you jump out to that, it'll take you to the main documentation for the language and so on. So over here on the left-hand side, there's a couple of things to be aware of. This C# programming guide and this language reference. Now over here in my slide, I have, from the programming guide, you can look at the types, the strings, the single dimensional arrays. From the language reference, if you look at the keywords and operators, these are things that we're going to be working with going forward in the class. And if you want more information, then these links can actually provide a little bit more supplemental to what's going on in class. So like language reference will take you to this. Going to the C# keywords, this is basically the list of stuff being asked for. And if you go into any one of those links, assuming we use them in class, you'll get a little bit more information as far as what the syntax would look like. So if you're ever curious, you're trying to figure out why this one thing just isn't working the way you thought it was, then chances are maybe there's some kind of a slight special thing that you've maybe overlooked for that particular one. So you can definitely go there and take a look. Now, again, we're not covering all of these. This is a very large language. It's been in development and in production for years at this point. But we will cover a handful of these things, string, return, true, false, etc. Okay? So those external references give you a little bit more area to investigate should you run into any kind of issues. So as we go through this class, we're going to look at both C# and Unity concepts. We're going to look at variables, operators, conditionals, loops, arrays, classes, and methods. Then over on the Unity side, we're going to look at how the interface actually works, the different windows, dealing with scripts themselves, the ins and outs, the pros and cons of different creation methods, different how you attach and detach, side effects of accidentally attaching multiples of the same script to different objects kind of scattered around throughout your scene. We'll be looking at game objects and components. The MathF library will come into play in the week 3 stuff. We'll also be using find. There's a number of find things built into Unity to allow you to both look through your scene, find certain named objects, but also look for certain types. So if I have some special UI and I know that that's the only quote-unquote text object in my scene, I can use a specific kind of find to find that thing and then use it in my code accordingly. We'll be looking at the input class to handle just dealing with key presses and that kind of stuff. And then we'll also be looking at linking that to Visual Studio. We'll be looking at linking that to Visual Studio and actively debugging issues, assuming that doing some simple printouts doesn't get you all the information you need. Sometimes you need to actively stop execution and look at what values are before the next line of code executes. So we'll be able to jump over and do that. So now I'm going to jump over to Unity. I'm going to be flipping back and forth between these slides and Unity, just demoing a number of different little things. So to start out, I'm going to open up Unity. And you guys are welcome to follow along, but again, these are recorded, so you can see all the stuff going from there. So I want to create a new project, 2D or 3D, doesn't matter. I don't want analytics. Now, your UIs might look a little different. This is a slightly different version of Unity. It's Pro versus the standard edition, so there's some extra stuff in here. But I want to, let's see here. I want to call mine PGF November lectures. Okay. Unity's going to go off and do its thing. And it takes a minute for it to construct the whole project itself, the databases and everything necessary to get this this thing off the ground, up and running. Okay, so what you'll notice here is, especially if you start out with the default view. Hold on one second. There we go. So when you very first start Unity, you'll get let's see here, like some kind of different layout, and you'll notice that each one of these windows has certain special attributes about it. So you can go through and, like some other programs like Visual Studio, for example, you can actually grab these individual tabs, click and hold or click and drag, and move them around. And they are aware of, as you get close to borders, can it dock? Can it be plugged into another set of windows? Can it free float? Like here, it's not docked to anything. All right, so it can definitely move around. So if you're ever trying to fight with it a little bit, just realize it's aware of where its neighbors are and that kind of stuff. So in addition to that, you can have multiples of some of these tabs. So some of these things are useful in other situations. You can also, again, certain situations dictate where when you're clicking around on stuff, your inspector will change. And sometimes you don't want your inspector to change. You want to focus on a particular object while selecting other ones and then maybe dragging them over. So like, if you're working with arrays and you want to select multiple things, but you don't want your inspector to change, you can use this little lock icon here to lock the inspector. And it's actually covered up, but there's a lock underneath this little window over here. Additionally, depending on, each one of these windows has their own custom settings. So like here, I've got this 2-column layout. You can click on this little arrow with the 3 horizontal slashes next to it and sometimes get additional options for that particular window. So for this class, I've actually got a predefined setup over here. You can ignore all the rest of these lighting, navigation, occlusion settings, services, and whatnot. But for this class, we basically need to be able to see the scene view, which is where we can move stuff around and construct live. This is kind of like Maya, where you can just build up your stuff. The game view is like the actual real-time preview, or when you're playing it, it will jump to this screen. The hierarchy, which is where all the stuff in this particular scene lives. The project, where all of the stuff that can be pulled into a scene or referenced in another way will live. This is actually stuff on your hard drive. So if you right-click and go to Show and Explore, you'll be taken to the assets directory of this particular project. And if you go in there, I don't have anything at the moment, but as you construct stuff, that's where things will be. The inspector over here is context sensitive based on whatever it is you've selected. And if you select off, or if you select it and control click to deselect, you won't get anything. So you can customize whatever object it is you're working on right here with these various settings and whatnot in the inspector. So let's see here. So game view, scene view, hierarchy project, inspector. And for what we're about to do in code, we want to get the program talking back to us. As programmers, as designers, as people dealing with programs, code in general, one of the very first things you will hear about as a developer is hello world. It is the very first step in making a program talk to you. As soon as you can get it to tell you something, the doors are wide open. You can start making it do all kinds of other things. Tell me about other systems. Then the next step is usually like getting it to respond to your input. So to do that inside Unity, we need the console window. Now, depending on your initial defaults, it might be here, it might not. But in my case, it's down here in the bottom. Right? So if it weren't here, let's say it was closed, I can always go up here to my file menu, and at the very bottom, I have console. And now that it's here, So I can click and drag and lock that in place. If I had something else, let's see, does it select? Yeah. If I had some other window highlighted, it was buried like over here in this number of tabs, I could just go to that window, select console again, and it would jump directly to it. Now, this is going to be a little interesting because I'm dealing with this interesting aspect ratio and whatnot. But as you scan across the options here, you'll notice that a slight gray versus the normal dark gray means it's a depressed button. It's active. So if you're ever trying to figure out why your code might be generating errors and you jump over to Unity and you're just not seeing it, there's a good possibility that these three toggles over here on the right have been disabled. So making sure that they are depressed will turn them on. So it's general information, just logs, just logging information, warnings, and then errors. So the way I've got mine currently set up is that duplicate messages, instead of spamming my screen with the same printout every single time, they will actually all collapse down to one single message, and I'll get a little counter over here on the right for how many times this thing has been executed. In this mode, I want, as soon as I hit play, I want whatever was there to be erased. So that's why I have clear on play enabled. If you were trying to jump like between some modified code from one run into the next, and you wanted to compare some values, you might not want that clear on play enabled because you want to compare, A to B. So it, much like anything throughout these kinds of programs, these tools give you the ability to customize for whatever scenario you're actively dealing with. In this case, I don't want the information from my previous session to be there, so I just clear it out. If you ever have issues or warnings or errors or whatever, and you're kind of jumping back and forth, some of them, just because of the way Unity works, some aren't necessarily directly related to coding errors that you might fix. And so some will stick around, and you'll look at it and go, well, there's an error here, so there must be something wrong. It might not be. It might be something Unity just isn't really paying attention to or is aware of. Just for example, if you have script errors and you try to play, you'll get a pop-up that says you must fix all of your errors before you can play. If you are in the scene view, a big pop-up will display right there in the dead center of your view. If you're in the game view, you won't get that pop-up, but you will get an error message. That error message isn't directly linked to your code, so it'll stick around even after you've repaired all of your errors. So in that case, this button down here on the left, clear, comes in handy. So you can just hit that and it'll clear out all the rest of the issues you were dealing with. Okay, so those are the windows we'll be dealing with. Let's see here. So we looked at changing the view and layout and whatnot, and you can actually come up here and use some of these defaults. The FS presentation is my own custom one. I got my screen to something that I liked, and then I saved the layout. So you can definitely fiddle around with these. You can revert back to factory defaults, etc. But just know that you can pretty much customize this program to your heart's content. So okay, so one of the things that we notice when we start out with a blank default scene is that we actually don't have a blank default scene. We have a camera and a light already in here. Now, some of this might be review from other classes as we look at what Unity's doing and the concept of game objects and components and that kind of stuff. But the idea is we tend to want to organize our stuff as we go forward. So it makes a little bit more sense. It's easier to read. We don't just have this massive collection of stuff over here in our both hierarchy and our project. And you can use folders in the hierarchy, or you can use actual game objects that don't have any components attached to them as like null parents. They can act like just empty objects out there in the scene, in a way like a folder, but actively live out here in your scene. So some of the ways to do this, if you're dealing in your hierarchy, you can right-click directly in the hierarchy view and say Create Empty. Okay. You could also go up here to Game Object and Create Empty, and it would create the same object. But you'll notice the inspector automatically selects the object we just created, but the transform is a little off. Now that's because over here in my scene view, my camera is actually just looking slightly over. Maybe earlier when I was demonstrating this scene, maybe I did this, and so it's not pointed directly at origin anymore. So wherever I'm looking is usually where this thing is going to be created. So it's right there in front of me, and I can move it around. Now I want these for organization purposes and for clean hierarchies. Anytime I create a new object, I want it to be at origin. It helps later on when I'm doing math, if I'm moving some transforms around, the position, rotation, and scale. Having these things set at origin as their defaults means that no additional information can basically dirty up the child transforms. It basically doesn't apply to further objects down the chain. So in this case, what I want to do, pull my window over just a little bit. Yeah, that'll work. Is this little cog icon here, the little gear icon. You'll notice that every one of these things that I select has a little book that jumps out to the Unity documentation for this particular thing. But you'll notice there's also this gear, this cog. And I have different options. Again, this is also context sensitive based on whatever the component is and whatever functionality is inside that. So in this case, you'll notice as I select through here, even the most default one that doesn't have anything, it has a transform. So from the highest possible level in our code, when we create a game object, we get a handful of settings. We have a name, whatever this thing is actually named. We have the ability to turn it on and off. We can notice it's selected over here, but as soon as I deselect, I don't have it anymore. And I shouldn't be able to select because it doesn't exist. It doesn't have a physical presence in my scene. But I can go up here to my game object, and I can click this little visual indicator drop down, and I can give it some kind of a color. And over here, notice it applied a little badge out there in my scene. Now, note I won't be able to see this in my game view because some of this stuff is only shown in the scene view. It's more debugging kind of information. So, but now that I have it, I can select it. Okay? So I don't really care about that. It doesn't really matter to what I'm going to demonstrate here in a second. But I do want to reset this thing back to origin. So to do that, I can either manually step into each one of these things and punch in a value of 0, 0, 0, or I can go up to this gear, click on, nope, not what I wanted, but there's a demonstration of jumping out to the manual if I wanted more information on that particular component. In this case, it's a transform. So I click that gear and go to reset. Reset shifts all these values back to 0, and you notice it kind of shifted over here in my scene. Okay, so now that I've started constructing a scene, and I'm going to be constructing a script here in a second, it is possible that the developers at Unity, while their engine is pretty robust and solid, there might be a memory leak somewhere in there, and it might crash. So it's always a good idea to both save your scenes and save your scripts. That way, if it ever does crash, you can recover pretty close to where you just were and not lose all kinds of work. So what I'm going to do, what I said earlier regarding organization of the project, I'm going to come down here to my project view, and I'm going to right-click and create a folder. And I'm going to call this scenes. And the idea is some of these things are using the plural form of the name because it's going to have multiple things in it. Even if I only have one, it would be the spot for holding multiple things. So I have scenes there, and I want to create one more and call it scripts. Okay, and you'll notice when I started to create this, I had it deselected. Sometimes when you have an object selected and you say, right-click, create a new one, it'll make it as a child, and that might not be what you want. So having it deselected, right-clicking, and creating will put it at the root level. So just something to be aware of. So I don't want either of those two, so I'm just going to control-click on either of the two to select them and then hit delete on my keyboard. Also, if I have one selected and I want to get rid of it, just like in normal Windows, press and hold Control and click on it, and it deselects everything. Sometimes the reason I show you that is sometimes these lists can have a lot of content, and it can be difficult to deselect. Even if you're trying to click out there in your scene, right? If I have something selected here in my hierarchy and I click over here in my scene, cool, it deselected. But I might have a big scene. I might have some kind of a view, some kind of mountainous terrain or some level. I might be inside a building. Good luck selecting out of a building when you're inside it. So knowing those little hotkeys can definitely be helpful. So now that I have my two folders for organization, this is let's see here. So I'm going to use Control S to save. I'm going to jump down into my scenes folder, and I'm going to call this day 1. Okay. So now if I look down here at my scenes folder, I have a little disclosure triangle. If I click that, I have a day 1 scene. Cool. So now I want to create a script that I can actually start messing around with. So also, by the way, Control S was the quick save for that. I can go up here to File, and notice every one of these things have shortcut keys. As you start developing, I know some people are coming to this stuff brand new. They don't have a lot of computer experience prior. So a lot of these shortcuts, what you'll find is just for sheer speed, it shaves seconds off of how quick you can be just by hitting Control S versus manually mousing up File, Save, and going through that process. So the more familiar you are with these hotkeys and where they exist and how they differ from program to program. Most of these things are uniform, like saving, new object, new scene, that kind of stuff. They're pretty much uniform. So once you've mastered them in one program, chances are it'll flow to any other ones. So in this case, I was dealing with scenes, so I had started with a new scene just by default, and I saved scene. But because it was the first one and it hadn't been saved before, it defaulted down to this save scene as, giving me the option to give it a name. Now, if I instead change something about this, notice day 1 and a little asterisk. That means that this scene is currently unsaved. I also see it up here in my title bar right next to standalone. So there I could either Control S or go up to this menu and hit save, and then I wouldn't get that name dialog because there's no naming needed. So I'm just going to reset that and Control S to save. Okay, so now that I have my game object, I actually want to do something with it. So to get Hello World functional, I need a script. I need that script to be able to send information over to my my console. So to do that in Unity, there's actually a couple of different ways to do it. One, you can come down here into your project view, right-click, and create a C# script. You could also, with the game object itself selected, you can go to Add Component, and you'll notice there's a lot of stuff in here. And you're totally welcome to go through and just look. As long as it's got this little arrow next to it, you can drill down and take a look. And these are other features that Unity gives you. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars and thousands of man hours trying to engineer this stuff because Unity Technologies has already done it. So just take advantage of what's there. So by adding these things, and again, by adding it, you now get documentation links directly to it. So you can just throw any of these things on a game object and real quick reference the documentation, take a look at what's going on. So the first way is right-click and create a C# script down here in the project view. The other way is add component. And if you start typing something and it doesn't match an already predefined component that's in the system, Unity assumes that you're probably naming a custom script. So if I said, let's say, day 1, notice I don't have a day 1 component anywhere in my scene or in my project. Neither of those two. I don't have a day 1 component anywhere in my toolbox of things that I can possibly add to this. It goes, you probably want a new script, which is actually what I want. So it'll default to selecting new script. And if I just hit enter, it'll jump to the customization screen for a new script. So yes, I want to go ahead with day 1. Yes, I want it to be a C# script. And I can hit create and add. Now, the third way of adding one of those scripts is up here under component. And let's see here, was it add? Yeah, so add will link you back over here to this add component, but then there should be down here under add let's see here. Do I get a new? I guess not. So it knows about the existing script that I just created, so I could add that component. Yeah, okay. So it's also worth noting that some of these options might change from version to version of Unity. So what may have been there now, like as you just saw, looking down through this list, looking at the, what was it, like AR, no, XR, these things didn't exist a few versions of Unity back. If I do game object, Vuforia, that's the newest augmented reality SDK that was added to this particular version of Unity, and now it's available in that list. So sometimes certain features in the engine can be what are called deprecated. Basically, they're flagged for removal at a future date. If you try to use them, you'll be notified, hey, this thing might be changing in the future, so you should probably look into some alternate solution and then use that. But sometimes naming changes, or names change as well. So locations and names, sometimes things get re-architected from version to version. So just keep that in mind as you also look through older documentation, like stuff that people have posted online. If you're reading through somebody's post from like 2013 or 2005 was when Unity first came online publicly. So anywhere between then and now, there's been a lot of discussion, and a lot of the forums, the answers, that kind of stuff that you can usually be linked to sometimes have simply out-of-date information. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that sometimes the page 2 or 3 of a discussion post might have what you're looking for. Yeah, so now that we have our object and it's got this script attached to it, now as you're constructing stuff in Unity, you'll notice it's got a couple of quirks to it. One, when I added this object here, it didn't give me a location for my script. Whereas if I was down here and I actually, let's see here, create C# script, just by having that folder selected, hitting create gave me the option to place that script inside this location as a child. Same as I showed you up here with, depending on what object you had selected. So it can vary. In this case, when you just add directly to a component, it drops it in the root of the project directory. In which case, again, because we want to stay organized, you got to click and drag on that script and move it to this scripts folder. So you can either pop it right there on top of scripts or kind of try to reorganize it like that. All right. Now, when it does, notice down here in the bottom right corner, this little spinning icon. Anytime you add a script, modify a script, remove a script, move a script, or asset, the overall project that you just were dealing with as far as Unity is concerned has to be rebuilt. So it's got to look through all your stuff, make sure everything's good, and as a result, if you're modifying a script, you save it, jump back to Unity, and then hit play, it won't immediately start playing. That's because it's still actively compiling. So you want to give it a chance to do all of its work, then start running. So in this case, I don't want this test2 script. I don't care about it. So I can right click and go to delete, confirm the delete, and it's gone. Now, this leads to a larger discussion on scripts. So as we're constructing these things, you can definitely come in here and try to create scripts and say day test. Notice I added a space. Now, as far as Unity is concerned, this file is okay, but as far as the internal engine functions, it has certain rules. Just like as we're about to discuss with methods, variables, all the stuff that we write, there are certain rules that apply to different things in different locations. And so when we're creating these files inside Unity, it's very easy to go in and say, yeah, my first name space last name space first name space the name of the file or whatever. The thing is, Unity's engine, the way it looks for these things, these scripts, these objects, these components, to be able to add them as components, it cannot have spaces. They're illegal as far as the engine's concerned. Now, you can have underscores but that's the only special character you can have. Now, if you notice over here in my inspector, the preview actually says day test. There is no space between this. Now, yeah, sure. Cool. Thank you. And now, so if I come up here to my game object that I created a minute ago, you'll also notice Unity takes some liberties as far as like displaying how some of this stuff looks to you. Like my script is day no space 1, but it looks like there's probably a space right here. Now, as we continue on and we start looking at different ways to see information in the inspector, you'll notice some things get capitalized in this view just because of how Unity thinks you intend to see it. Keep in mind that is strictly just the view that's presented to you and does not reflect the actual code that you're writing at the time. So just a couple of little oddball things to watch out for. But now if I take this day test and I try to apply it, I get this error telling me that Unity basically requires that the file name and the class name must match 100%. If they do not, I cannot attach this script as a component. So the fix for this is 2 or 3 different things I could do. I could simply remove that space. That would allow me then, once it finishes compiling, to attach this script. Everything's fine. Now, as a side note, every one of these scripts that you attach to a game object, any game object, if I take this day 1 and attach it to my camera, as these objects in my scene start, as you hit play and as your scene kind of boots up, they all get executed. Meaning, if I have day 1 in multiple spots and I'm expecting to see one single report, I will now have every single one of those instances out there in my scene reporting back to me. So be aware, as this is particularly noticeable when we get into the week 3 when we're building the Arkanoid project. You will sometimes accidentally add like a brick script or some other like whatever script to another object accidentally. This is where the attention to detail thing comes in. If you accidentally drop it onto something, stop. You can probably use undo at that moment to undo whatever action you just did, which for reference is either here under edit, and then it'll say whatever the previous action was that it can possibly undo, or just Control Z on your keyboard. So you might accidentally add a script which might change the internal logic of your game. So it's useful and sometimes critical to pay attention to what you've added where and to just double check. Sometimes as a quick sanity check, you can just go through, select your object, arrow down through it, and just kind of do a quick scan, a visual scan. Like, oh, I have 2 scripts on this object. Did I mean to? Maybe I didn't. If that's the case, again, that gear, that little cog gear icon, I can click on it and go down to remove component. So I can get rid of that. Now I'm guaranteed that I only have that one. So the other option is I can add, like I said earlier, the underscore. That's the only other special character that we can use. A tack or a hyphen won't work. A like caret won't work. $sign won't work. They just aren't valid as far as the computer is, as far as the compiler and whatnot is concerned when it's looking this stuff up. It has to make sense to it, so some of those rules apply. So in this case, I'll go ahead and make a modification to this script here inside Unity, but I still need to modify the script itself, because remember I said that the file name and the class name have to match. I'm going to show you the class name in 1 second. So to make this script modify the way I want it to, I'm just going to add an underscore, day underscore test. Okay. Now to open this script, I have a few different options. One, I can just generically open up the entire editor. In this case, to start out with, if I want to verify that I'm dealing with Visual Studio, the correct version of Visual Studio, and not mono develop. So I go over here to Edit, down to Preferences, under External Tools, and I look right here at the top, External Script Editor, and I make sure that that's currently set to Visual Studio. Okay, so I know that that'll probably jump out to whatever it is I need, or It'll open the solution that Unity generated behind the scenes for me. So I can either go up here to Assets, all the way down at the bottom, Open C# Project, which will just wholesale jump over to Visual Studio and open up the project. I could, with this file down here, which for those of you who just caught that, I had the file already selected, and I clicked it one time. That's like a long tap on something like iOS or Android where you press and hold to get editing functionality. It's also F2 on a PC, and if you're on a Mac, which you shouldn't be for this class, it's also pressing Enter on the keyboard. It'll go into rename mode. So in this case, just having the object selected, clicking one more time gives me the rename capability. Clicking once will select. Clicking again just a second later, not a double click, that opens it. A single click right after. So in this case, if I have applied the script to an object and I want to go directly to that script, I can either double click right here inside this script well, this drop well. Let's see here. Do I have? Yep. So on script components, I also have edit script down here at the bottom, or I can double click the individual script down here, or over here in the inspector, I can hit open. So you have a number of ways to get to a single script. In this case, just like I said, this is the one I want to modify, so just double clicking it will open up Visual Studio, and we will now see the project, the solution, all the necessary files mimicking the order that we saw over in Unity. So notice day_test and then day test. All I have to do is come into the top here. This is the class name up here, public class name. This is where I would make that modification. So just adding that underscore, saving the file. Now if I jump back over to Unity, it's going to recompile, and this script will now be allowed to be applied. Right? It's doing its compile. Grab the game object, drop it on there, everything's fine. So those two things have to match if this word mono behavior is at the end of that class. Mono behavior is what tells the Unity engine that this thing is capable of being a component. It is capable of taking advantage of some of the stuff that's built into Unity. If you notice this, let me jump over to my other script here. So we'll go into day one because it's already attached to my game object. So I'll just double click that. So over here, when you create a script, just by default, Unity is going to give you a handful of things. It knows, it assumes that you probably want to start out by doing some kind of initialization and then some kind of update as time progresses on. So it gives you start, and if you refer back to that link I showed you earlier, the execution order, scroll down, you'll notice starts up towards the top. It's the initialization, and then update happens once per frame. So I want to see something one time, I'll do it in start. I want to see something every frame, or I want to poll for input from the user, then I can put that inside update and work accordingly. So let's take a look back over here at the slide. So we've covered a number of these issues to rename stuff, attaching with duplicates, Visual Studio. Okay, so now let's actually get this program talking to us. Let's make Unity say something. So, like I said, I only want this hello world to present to me one time. Now I can modify that, and I can show you that collapse down there in the console, and I can show you how it's going to present that like every single frame. To start out with, let's just get the one bit of information onto the screen. So I know that I want to log something, and log happens to live inside the debugging library. The idea is we don't have necessarily a console window in a final game, right? We don't have some secondary window that's giving us reports. There are caveats to that, but generally speaking, we don't want this kind of information being dumped to some kind of console somewhere, because dealing with this kind of information is actually slow. Dealing with strings this manner pumping out through the computer can be a little slow. So it lives in a place called debug, which means it won't live in a final release. So debug versus release. So to access that, I know that it's part of the debug class. So if I just start typing DE, Visual Studio is aware of where this information lives. That comes to me courtesy of those 3 lines at the very top of the file, the usings. In this case, Unity Engine happens to have debugging information built into it. And if you'll notice, it might be hard to see up there on the screen, but the first 2 lines are actually kind of a darker gray color than the 3rd line. That's because Visual Studio is smart enough to say, you're not actively using anything inside those other libraries, those other frameworks. So we're going to just color code it to say, you could get rid of it, but it's not necessary at this point. So debug is the library, the location, the namespace that I want to talk to. And log, just by typing L, it starts to filter down my list of things that I have access to. So log is what I want to be able to present information to the screen. Now, as the class rolls on and we start talking about methods and how they're constructed and that kind of stuff, we will start seeing what these different bits and pieces mean. This is kind of a, I'm leaping ahead just a little bit, but also like just trust that it works, and we'll start looking at what's under the hood shortly. So just to get something to my screen, I need some kind of an output mechanism. This happens to be what Unity is using as its output mechanism. So I want to say something, and a sentence, a single word, that kind of stuff, it's what's called a string. So when we're writing, sentences and that kind of stuff, we put them inside quotes to differentiate them from other variables. And here in just a second, I'll go further into the variable types that we have access to, and you'll see how they vary from type to type. But for the moment, I just want to, inside my double quotes, now Visual Studio also said, oh, you're about to add a string? You probably want the beginning and ending of this string. As we write code just in general, you're going to notice certain things always have pairs. There's an opening and a closing. Notice when I started typing debug log and the parentheses, I got a closing parenthesis at the end. Start right up here has 2. It also has this open curly brace bracket and a closing one right down here. The same thing with update. It's got the parentheses and the curly brackets. Same thing up here at the top with public class. I've got an opening and a closing down here at the bottom. All of my code has to live somewhere inside those curly brackets. And as class goes on, we'll start seeing how we can modify and how these things can live and be seen in different spots. This is all part of the lifespan of different objects. This is what's referred to as the scope of something. It lives just in this little small window of lifetime, or it's more long term. It lives for the rest of the program. So here, because a string always has a double quote at the beginning and a double quote at the end, it knows and it gives me the closing. Sometimes it can fight you on that, and you actually have to move your cursor around and try to delete if you're trying to do something special, but those are edge cases. So in this case, I just want to say, hello, world. And notice I've got this little red squiggly at the end. Just like with English sentences or sentences in any other language, or grammar, punctuation, that kind of stuff, C#, any other language, has certain rules about it. So when we're writing a sentence, we usually use some form of punctuation to terminate that line. A period is the normal thing that we use. In code, the thing that terminates a line is a semicolon. So if you pretend for a moment that I just left this code like this. If I say save, jump back to Unity, let it compile, it's going to tell me, whoa, something about your script is not cool. What did you intend to do? And if you look down here inside my console, notice I have the error button depressed, so I get a little 1. This is also that 1 for the counter that I was talking about. So it says in this script on line 10, jumping over 2 spaces, so X and Y, or Y and X, whichever, this is the error code. And you can take this error code, punch it into Google, and look up what these kinds of things mean. And in this case, it says that a semicolon was expected. So if I click on this, I will not only get a selection bubble for a split second around the offending file, but I also get down here in my console a secondary window, which is, it's actually always there. So yeah, no. But when you select any particular thing, warning, error, log, doesn't matter, you'll get additional information down here at the bottom. You'll get more information because right here I only have 2 rows worth of stuff printed out. Down here I can have a lot more. It's worth checking those out. So in this case, the semicolon was expected. Okay, so if most errors, warnings, and logs in here, if you double click it, it should take you right back to Visual Studio and should put you right on the line where that error, warning, or log occurred, where it was generated. So in this case, I'm just going to double click on this. And now I'm taking, my cursor is actually at the end of line 10. What it's telling me is that inside start, right? I said start only runs that one time. So its lifespan is from the beginning curly bracket to that end curly bracket. So from lines 8 to 10. Anything inside that has to live for that one little slice of time, and then it's obliterated. Now in this case, the compiler's looking at what I wrote, runs across debug log hello world, hits that parenthesis and says, whoa, I don't understand what that next character is, the closing curly bracket. I expected a period, to end the sentence. In this case, it's a semicolon. So that's, the error specifically saying it expected a semicolon. That's what I need. And if I mouse over, it says a semicolon was expected. Okay, so the solution is straightforward, semicolon. Now that little red squiggly goes away. If I save, jump back to Unity, it finishes compiling. This error goes away. Cool. So now, notice my little asterisk here. We've already got the script on here. We can jump over and see that. Cool. Now, ignore that. That's just the engine reporting something. At this point, I can run this to verify what I just wrote actually shows me stuff in that console. The problem is, like I said earlier, sometimes Unity can crash. So you want to, get into the habit of safeguards. In this case, I can see both up here in my title bar, the little asterisk next to standalone, and here in day 1, that little asterisk there, I need to save this scene just as a safety check. So Control S saves that. And now if I run by hitting play, down here in my console, I see one time hello world. And you'll notice I said I get 2 layers of printout here, and I get more down here at the bottom. You'll notice I get where this call came from. In this case, the day 1 class, the start method. It exists on this line number 9. So what I can do is double click this, and it takes me right where that information came from. So this can be useful for trying to track down, like if you accidentally log out a number and that number changes every frame, it can be a nightmare, especially if it's logging a variable number throughout thousands of frames. It can be a nightmare to track that thing down. But just double clicking on it will take you to the log responsible for that output. So you can say, okay, cool. Now that I found you, I can turn you off and we no longer have that information being dumped to the screen. So now we can look at, let's see here. We can do one other thing. We can take this line. I can either triple click to select the whole thing, or click, drag, select, that kind of deal. Jump down here to update and paste, and I want to change this to lots of output. And sometimes Visual Studio is going to try to do some formatting, so just clean it up a little bit. So in this case, if I save, lots of output, because it's being called inside update, is going to dump to my screen a lot of times. So if I jump back to if I jump back to Unity, I'm currently playing, which is not a cool thing. While the file did change, and it looks like it hot loaded, that's not a good thing to do. You generally want to make sure that you're not playing. A quick way of visualizing that is if you go over here to Edit, down to Preferences, down to Colors, and scroll down, there is a, let's see here, play mode tint. You can actually change, clicking on that image well, you can change this color to be something else. And then if you're playing, notice my entire Unity UI other than the game window has changed to that particular color. This is anything you change at this moment will be reverted kind of error indicator to you. Because if you start modifying stuff like over here, if I take my camera, let's see, can I rotate it in a different way? The second I stop playing, it gets reverted back to whatever it was before I started playing. So just something to be aware of. Whatever, I'll fix that later. So, but you'll notice down here, lots of output was seen and started dumping a lot of output to my screen. 1,262 at current count. So if I move this, if I click on the dividing bar right here, it's the console. So I can kind of pull this up and get a little bit more real estate. If I unselect collapse, I now see that I had a lot of output being printed to my screen. So this can kind of be a pain if you're trying to sort through, trying to hunt something down. Notice I'd be scrolling for a while if I wanted to try to find all this. And at the very top, there's where my start, the very first thing that happened, and an update took over from there. So that's cool. Now I can see that information exists. Clear and jump back to Unity, or jump back to my slides. Okay, so now let's actually get into what makes code code. So you can think of these things, the stuff that we're about to write, in terms of two different basic concepts. No matter how complex your program is, it is basically two things. It's information, also known as state or data, and it's functionality, also known as behavior. You can think of this in terms of nouns. It's a person, place, thing, or idea versus a verb. It's an action. So we have the information, and then we can act upon it, or we can do some stuff to calculate said information. And these two things kind of interact with each other. Usually it's the verbs interacting with the nouns. We're updating data, or we're retrieving data to display stuff. Now, you can think of a variable as a bucket, a customized bucket. One might be really good at holding sand. The next one might be great at holding water, so on and so forth. But generally speaking, it's made up of three components. Three different pieces make up the concept of this data, this state. It's the variable type, what it is that we're actually dealing with. A label so that we can call it from somewhere else so we know what it's called, and then the value that's actually stored inside it. So, imagine your bucket that can hold sand is different than your bucket that can hold water. On that bucket, there's the word sand. On the other bucket, there's the word water. And let's say your bucket has sand in it, but your water bucket is empty. So what you do with these types, what the bucket can hold, the name, what's written on the bucket, and then what's inside the bucket, those three constituent parts make up a variable. Now, the behavior, as we further go into class, we'll start seeing that we can write our own custom stuff. We can write our own custom functionality. We can take advantage of the functionality that's built into Unity, also the data, the state that's built into Unity elsewhere. And you'll notice that as time progresses on, we're actually already using some of this stuff, and it'll become more apparent, like start and update. Those are bits of behavior that's built into Unity. The different things that we see over there in the inspector, I showed you the name where it says game object. That's the name, the game, name itself is what's written on the bucket. Quote unquote game object is what's inside the bucket. That's the value. So let's see here. So as we construct these things, one of the more difficult things to kind of, they're fairly straightforward, but it can be very difficult because they are so similar. The the concept of determining what these statements are. So we have three of them. There's a declaration, there's a definition, and then there's assignment. Each one is functionally slightly different in terms of how it's written in syntax. We're assigning something to something. This is the bucket has a type, the bucket has a name, and the bucket has a value. Those three things, you can omit some of those depending on the situation. You can add some other ones depending on the situation. And we'll see this here in code in just a second. But when we declare a variable, we're saying at some point in the future, I'm going to assign a value to this thing. So we have those three pieces, but we omit that last value. We let the system default, and it depends on what the value is, what the type is, what that default value will be. But to write these things in code, we have three pieces as well. We have the type, we have the label itself that we're going to use to refer to it, reference it later on, and then we have the semicolon. Like you saw with the debug log, the semicolon ends that line of code. If we're going to define something, we have a few more pieces. And while this slide kind of looks a little verbose, all it is the three from the declaration, but we're adding an equal sign and a whatever the value is that we want to store in this thing. So when you see it in practice in actual code here in a second, it'll make a lot more sense. But the reason I specifically wrote these two things up here at the top is because sometimes you'll be asked, this is like one of those possibly test questions, possibly interview questions, what's the difference between a definition and a declaration? Well, there's a couple of mnemonics that I just brainstormed to think about these two things and how you could very quickly answer this question. The first one uses counting. So we have the type, we have the label, and we have the semicolon. That's just three little things. The next one, we have the type, we have the label, we have the assignment operator, count those as two, we have the value that we want to fill it in with, and then we have that semicolon again. That's 6 total items. If you look at the two words, declaration and definition, the third letter in both of those, C and F, they are 3 characters in from A and 6 characters in from A, the C and the F. So you can, if you're into the math side of it, you can use that as a mnemonic for remembering, like, I'm writing more stuff. F, as in definition, is further into the alphabet than C. It's a shorter amount of stuff to write. The other, probably quicker way of dealing with this is the word definition. What are you looking for when you crack open a dictionary? You're looking for definitions. It contains the word and what its value is. So using that alone, you can omit the whole concept of declaration and just say a definition is like what a dictionary is. It's the name and the value. The critical part of this is the and the value. That's what differentiates these two lines. Now, later on, let's say either of those two, you declared a variable or you defined a variable. Later on, you want to modify that. You want to set it equal to something else. The act of setting it equal to something else is called assignment. And we'll see that in a second, that the only difference between definition and declaration is the additional assignment operator kind of snuck right in between as numbers 3 and 4 of the definition. That's like one single operation. You've seen, we've not written these things yet. This will be in another lecture upcoming, but you've so far seen method calls. I said that there's state and then there's behavior. Well, behavior usually comes in the form of shrink-wrapped bits of functionality that live somewhere in the system or somewhere we've written. And we call that. We say, hey, system, do this. You know, like debug log. We're saying, hey, debug location, whatever that is, I'm going to call the method log, and I'm going to pass it this information, the stuff that's inside the double quotes. So another quick mnemonic for remembering method calls is it has a parenthesis pair at the end. So the parenthesis is what makes this thing a method call. We are actively saying, and if you, mnemonic wise, if you think about the two parentheses, putting your hands together, yelling, we are going to call this bit of functionality, we're calling to it. So we send information to some other thing, or we just, make ourselves say to something else like, hey, this is what we want to execute, some other bit of functionality wrapped up elsewhere. Let's see here. So now we can actually start looking at the components of a variable to construct these declaration, definition, and assignment bits and pieces. So we talked about types so far as this thing that describes what we will hold on to. The water bucket versus the sand bucket. What's the difference between those two? It's the type. Holds sand, holds water. In code, we have several different base concepts for data. If we wanted to store numbers, 1, 10, 55, 9,000, -2, those kinds of numbers, they don't have fractional components whatsoever. They're what are referred to as whole numbers in math. And so to store a whole number, it's also referred to as an integer. And so in code, we have what's called the int, int type. So you see that's listed there under the example. So the string earlier that I was talking about that we passed off to debug log, hello world, that's a sentence. That's a chunk of characters that represent the words hello, space, and world. So that is also a basic data type that we can plug information into. We can modify these things at will. We can do math on them. We can do special kinds of operations that squish these things together. Like they're what's called concatenating operations. We can concatenate two different things together or more, 2+ things together. We can mix different types. So you can have numbers and strings or strings and numbers depending on how you write it, and they will, by the system, know and understand how to turn that into something that can be printed or displayed in some other way. And again, we kind of go back to the whole concept of where these things live in your code matters. Who can see them? We deal with scope in terms of when I open and close using the curly brackets, I open like a I don't know, Doctor Who fans, a time window, a bubble of reality for a split second. Then when I close it off with a curly bracket, it's destroyed. Now, you noticed over in your C# file where we had class, there was a curly bracket at the beginning and a curly bracket at the very end, meaning everything inside that, including the start and the update, all lived inside that class's scope. So those are what are referred to as global. We have global access, and if I created stuff inside start, it lives for only as long as start is there. Same thing for update. The thing is, update just happens to be called numerous times. So we get the same thing just a zillion and one times, as opposed to start where we get it just the one time. So when we get into some of the stuff you've already seen, and we'll go into it here in just a second in code, the ability to assign, so the assignment operator, meaning I'm going to take one value and I'm going to put it into some container. I'm going to put the sand inside the bucket. I'm going to put the water inside the bucket. That is a single equals. And it's important to remember that, because later on we'll introduce the concept of a double equals, which means something completely different. So here we're just saying you equal this. Blank is equal to blank. X is equal to Y, that kind of thing. Or sorry, X equals Y. We assign, we stick the value into it. Now, the stuff I was talking about a second ago with mixing in numbers as well as strings, we can do math. If it's purely numbers, we can do mathematical operations. But we can also mix in strings and kind of turn those into output of different kinds. So not only can my thing say lots of output in hello world, but I can actually plug numbers into that. the plus operator at this point, it's one of several operators that we're going to get into as this class rolls on, but this one operator, plus, actually has two different bits of functionality. It actually serves dual roles. So it will do plus for math-based operations. So like my variable equals 1 plus 1. Well, my variable now has the value of 2. So if I had strings, it would switch over. Instead of doing mathematical operations, it would do, I'm going to turn, if it was a number, I'm going to turn that number into a string, and then I'm going to add it to this other string that you've given me. Or if you gave it two strings, it's going to just plug those two together. So then I mentioned you could plug in numbers into this stuff. If you just used the label that we described, whatever it is, if you just use that inside the double quotes, it doesn't understand that that's a variable. It just sees that as just another word in that string. But you can stop the string using the double quotes. You can do the plus, and then you can plug in that variable name, and it will understand I'm going from a string to some other type. And it understands how to stitch those things together, or how to internally flip over to do math operations or whatever. So that's actually the last slide on that. We can jump over to code real quick and give a quick little demonstration. Okay, so we already saw we're calling out to log and we're passing in these strings. Now, what I can additionally do, notice how these lines, use this for initialization, update is called, blah, blah, blah. These are more like just normal sentences. These are called comments. The compiler sees this stuff and just eradicates it. It doesn't include this in the final version of the project. So we can actually come in and use that functionality to turn off other code that we maybe don't want, in our production build, or we're about to submit this to a team project and we don't want all of our logs to pollute everybody else's consoles, but maybe we want to keep it around for our additional testing or whatever. So we can go through and do 2 forward slashes to turn this stuff off on either line. Now there's additionally, like let's say I had more information that went onto multiple lines. Sure, I could do the multiple forward slashes on multiple lines, but maybe I have a big block of functionality, or maybe I want to turn off this entire class. So we additionally have the ability, instead of doing 2 forward slashes, if we do 1 forward slash and an asterisk, notice how everything after this line turned green. But also notice I got an error. Hey, I expected a closing version of this. Just like with our parentheses and our curly brackets, we have to turn this thing off because it's a blind attack of all of our code. It's doing something. In this case, it's turning it all off, but we need to tell it when to stop turning stuff off. So down at the very bottom, or wherever we want to stop it prematurely, we just step in and say asterisk semicolon. And now, public, if I was to start typing, notice the coloring is back to whatever it was. So I can prototype different things, different kinds of, like I want to modify start a number of different ways or whatever. I can block comment just this little thing. The only caveat to this is that if you have that ahead of time, notice how it re-enabled start. So you kind of have to pick and choose your battles with this. It considers this and this as that block. So sometimes it doesn't work. As you expect, sometimes if you have more stuff in there, you have to kind of think ahead to whatever problem it is you happen to be trying to solve. Okay, so we did the hello world a second ago, but now let's say I want to do, I'm writing a much longer sentence. So debug.log hello world, my name is Tony, and I am 36 years old. Okay, now if I save this and jump back over to Unity, let it compile. By the way, every so often you'll see different kinds of warnings. If you see this one where it talks about inconsistent line endings, that's not really an error, or it's not a warning that you should really be worried about. This is because Unity is written as a multi-platform engine, meaning you can target Windows, Mac operating system, Linux, and so on and so forth. And so it tells you, hey, the line endings of how a Windows file, doesn't matter what file it is, just how it's written and how those line endings are encoded, is different than what Unity just created. So that C# file, when I said, create new C# file, it created a file for me, but that creation stuff was probably geared towards the Mac OS, meaning here it's going to say, hey, your new lines and line form feeds and that kind of stuff. It's how the internal binary of a file works out. So it's saying, hey, I've detected an issue. This could potentially pose a problem. Usually it's nothing, so you can actually, to kind of quickly get around that, you might have to do this with every one of the files. You can actually close Visual Studio, reopen it, and as soon as it opens back up, you'll get a dialog that pops up saying, hey, I've detected that there's some kind of a line ending's different. You want me to convert it? And in this case, yeah, go ahead, convert it to Windows, carriage return line feed is what that means. So as soon as I do that, you'll notice, hey, something got edited along through here, but we don't see it. That's because these line endings are slightly different. They're actually invisible to humans unless you're looking, or they're invisible to most of our editors as well. But if you know what to look for, you crack it open in like a binary editor or something like that, you can actually see little lines at the end. So in this case, because of that change, I need to save the file, jump back over to Unity, and let that compile. Okay, so now if I hit play, you'll see I get this printout. Hello world, my name is Tony and I am 36 years old. Now if this was really long, it might go off the screen and it might, like down here it's wrapping around. But let's say you were fixed in terms of real estate. You couldn't move these windows over and you needed that extra line, to drop down by one. So here inside the string itself, we do formatting within the string, because when it gets displayed, that's where that customization. You want to add spaces. Well, there are spaces there. You want to add a tab, a new line, like you hit enter on your keyboard. Like here, my name is Tony. So I'm going to delete that space and hit enter on my keyboard. Now you'll notice it took my string, sliced it right in two, and turned it into two strings. Notice the plus in the middle. This is string concatenation. This takes the string on the left, hello, my name is Tony, and the string on the right, and I am 36 years old, stitches them together, and then hands off that one string to debug. That's why we would see that on screen. But you notice I removed that space between Tony and before I hit that enter. Meaning, if I save this, jump back to Unity, and play, this is what it looks like before. Okay, and actually I'm going to turn off clear on play so we can see the next one. Notice right here, Tony and is all one word. Okay, that's not exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to break my sentence onto two separate lines. But what it did was took one single sentence and said your two sentences, and the formatting of that space I removed. So what I want to do now is I want to either one of two things. I can add a space at the beginning here, or sorry, at the end of Tony, or at the beginning of and it will restore that. But my intent here is to actually drop this on a second line. So I don't want a space if it's dropped onto a second line. So I can use what's called a new line. It's like hitting enter on your keyboard, but in formatting. So it's a new line escape sequence because it does something different. And there are other escape sequences out there, tabs, inserting backslashes into your code, different things like that. And if you go looking through that documentation that I linked in earlier, if you just look around for escape sequences, C# escape sequences, you'll see there's a list of them. They do different things. So in this case, the way to inject a new line formatting character is a \n. Now that's different than the double forward slashes we were dealing with earlier. The double forward slashes are specifically for commenting out, and using them here does nothing. However, because of the way the strings are understood and how they're processed, a single new line means something. In fact, notice how that error popped up? If I wanted to write out a string, hello, my name is, but I wanted to wrap my own personal name with quotes, I can't just put a quote there because it thinks I'm ending that string, and then it's confused as to what's going on next. So a double quote is also an escape sequence. So adding one more quote satisfies those two there on the left, and it also ends the line. Okay? So I'm going to remove that real quick. So now if I jump back over to Unity, hit play, you'll notice, hello, my name is Tony, and I'm 36 years old. Drops onto two separate lines. So that's how I can format. Now, taking this information, I actually want to make my name and my age variable. Right now, it's constant, it's fixed, it's hard-coded, it is literal. It is in the string literals. I want to make it variable. I want to break it out into another couple of variables. So the type, label, value stuff we were talking about earlier, type is going to be integer, so int. I want to have a value for my age. So I'm going to do in, indicating that it's an integer. Right? Could also be I, but we'll stick with in and call it age. And I'm going to, if I left this alone, that is a declaration. Okay? Now, I could come along later and using the assignment operator say in age equals 36. So now I'm using two of the three things that we worked with. But now my name, I also want to create that. I want to break it out into its own variable, but I want to also set it as a definition. So in this case, it's going to be a string, and I'm going to say S for string. These prefix characters, the N and the S, and you'll see more as we continue on. These are what are referred to as Hungarian notation. It's an older style that basically means if my file is crazy long, or if I'm on a system that doesn't have the pretty the syntax sugar of and syntax highlighting stuff here, if I'm looking at it like on a server where all I've got is just a Vi or Vim, one of those text editors, using those little prefix letters in S, etc., I can identify that this is a number or this is a string and go from there. So S in this case is for string, and I'll say name. I want to assign that. Here I'm using the assignment operator built right in. I'm going to say Tony, and again end it with a semicolon. So now that I've got that information, I'm not actually using it. That's why these things are showing up as the red squiggly, because it's there, but it's not actually used. So I want to apply in age into my line of text here, but I also want to apply this S name as well. So to do that, I'm actually going to take this line, copy it. Let's see here. I'm going to use that block commenting stuff I showed you earlier. Okay, /*, go to the bottom of wherever go to the end of where I want to terminate this line, */, and now it's turned off. Now I already have that still copied, and remember I said Visual Studio is going to try to format some stuff sometimes. That's what just happened there. So hitting Control-Z once will undo that auto format, but it'll preserve my paste here. So I want to come through here and say, hello, my name is Tony, but I want to use S name. So to do that, I also want to preserve this new line character at the end. So I know I can get rid of the word Tony, but I need to plug in my variable so that the string concatenation stuff steps in and pluses all these things together. So I can do plus to terminate the left string, hello, my name is. I can add one more quote to terminate the right side, the new line, and in this case it would actually probably be better if I just took this new line and moved it down to the bottom line. but this will actually demonstrate using multiple strings in a single line, so I'll keep it. Between these two quotes, I can put whatever, right? So in this case, I know I want to reinsert the variable for name, so s name. But notice it's still complaining because it doesn't understand taking one string and then a variable and then another string. The plus seems okay, but that's just a fluke of it looking ahead. I know that I need to add, stitch, concatenate these two things together. So to combine hello world, my name is with the variable Tony, or with the variable s name, which contains Tony, I need to add that plus. Just going to put those together. And I need to do the same thing on the right of s name. So that stitches those things back together. Now at this point I can save, jump back to Unity, and play. And I get my printout just as it was. I haven't modified the date or the age, but I modified the Tony variable or Tony string. But notice I also got a warning. This warnings in both Visual Studio, warnings, errors, etc., both over in Visual Studio and in Unity are good heads up that something you think you might have written or intend to write or use or whatever later on might not actively be used. And so it's always a good idea to reference back to it. And like I said, you can just double click on this and it takes me to what the offending bit of code is. This error says that this variable in age is assigned, but it's never actually used. Okay, well I know that it's supposed to be 36 down here. So I can take 36 and what I just did with the s name, I can do the same thing. In this case, instead of a string, it's an integer. But the system knows how to convert that number into a string to do the math on it. So if I just delete the 36, add a quote to end the left string, add a quote to begin the right string, and in between those two, I can add my pluses because I know I'm going to stick some variable in there, plus on the left, plus on the right, and now in age. Okay, so everything else in that line stops complaining in terms of the error. Save that file, jump back to Unity, give it a second to compile. Play. Also notice that warning went away. The warning was known by Unity, so it knew to get rid of it. And now, when I run, notice I got a number 2 here. That's because this same line of code, variables or otherwise, was still executing from that same spot, printing out the exact same code. So it knew that this was a duplicate of the same code. So it gave me a number 2 right there. So the problem with this, to wrap up, is that I can't, down here inside update, call out to in age. Notice it doesn't exist in my list. It is giving me errors on the word itself down there at the bottom. The same thing for s name. It doesn't pop up in my list. So what's going on? Well, remember earlier I said that the scope of this stuff matters, these curly brackets. When I begin this little bubble of time and space, and then I destroy the universe down here on 21, everything created inside this code or inside this scope is destroyed. Now I can do assignments and I can do, usage of that code all day long and there's no problem. But the type and then the name, so in this case the declaration and then the, whoops, not that, the definition and the assignment, these two are the problem lines. I actually need to move these out to live longer if I wanted to use those two variables inside something other than start. So what I can do is make a quick copy of those two lines, come up here to the top, just below my public class but above my start, and inside the global scope, again because of this curly bracket, I can paste. Now this and this, they are the same, but the system doesn't understand that one isn't the original. And so what can happen is you basically have clones, but you're not dealing with the original. When I say the same, I mean their names, their types, they're identical, but where they live, they actually exist in different spots. This age here is like day one dot age. This age would be something like day one dot start dot age. They live in different hierarchies, much like any other hierarchical organizational trees you've ever seen. You know, Windows folder structure. You have something nested inside a folder is different. Could be the exact same file. You could copy paste that into another folder, same file, two different locations. So in this case, I don't want a duplicate here. And in fact, if I save this, jump back to Unity, let's see if it gives me any kind of heads up. So here, talking about day one dot name is assigned but never used. So if I double click on that, it's telling me that this version up here at the top is assigned but never used. Well, why would that be? Well, if I scroll down here and take a look at 15, I redeclare or I redefine the variables that I created up top. So I've basically overwritten the value and the name and label and all that stuff. So after this point, in age right here, and this is kind of cool, Visual Studio, if you click on the variable in question, notice how it highlights blue, blue, and then green here on 14, but it does not show me 7. That's it knowing the path to the variable you were dealing with. So now I can get rid of those by, again, using the single forward slashes. Okay, and now if I select age here, it jumps all the way back up here to 7. It's understanding where these things live, who I'm actually talking to, using the tool Visual Studio to show you which things you're actually dealing with. So I could actually scroll down here, and just as a goof, I could say the age that I'm dealing with, I want to assign it to the current age plus 1. So every single time this line of code executes, it's going to take the current age right here. It's going to say, what are you? In this case, 36. I'm going to take plus 1, and I'm going to store that, overwriting 36 as 37. So now, if I debug.log, I can print out that statement, or I can, attach that variable inside inside another string, giving it some kind of like a label, like lifespan as the years progress or whatever. But I could also just notice right here, object message. That gives it the ability to kind of understand different things, integers, strings, those squished together things get turned into strings. But here I can just say in age. Close it off, save it, jump back to Unity. My warnings and everything should go away. Okay, I'm going to do clear on play, leave collapse alone, and run. So now, scrolling all the way back up here to the top, I've got, hello, my name is Tony, using the variable. I am 36, using the variable. And then update is kicking off with a unique print every single time. So it just runs. And now I've exceeded 999. So it's just continuing on until it's told to stop. So using this information, you can use assignment, the equal sign, to set one thing equal to something else. You can use the plus to combine different types of data. Numbers, strings, strings and strings, numbers and numbers. And what the output will be will depend on what you're trying to do. I can do number and then some label, right? Or sorry, I can do integer and then some label, right? Integer being the type, int, the label being whatever, so int x equals, and then whatever other stuff I do after that, but because I'm dealing with an integer, a number, it all has to be math. I can't put a string in there, otherwise it'll give me errors. So I could do, equals 5 plus 5. So that x, if I printed x, would be 10. I could turn around and say string word value whatever equals, and then do that x again, and then that string would be quote whatever that number is, and it would print that out. So then I could string, do crazy formatting and add square brackets in the stuff to make it look like scoring systems or whatever. So I have, and you have, complete control over however you want to fiddle around with this stuff, just as long as you're maintaining awareness of these different rules, the scope, locations, the mixing of the different types, integers, strings, using the plus, using the equals, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I believe doing floats on Wednesday. Yeah, I believe that basically covers everything that I wanted to cover for this particular lecture. So I'm going to real quick take a look at the comments. Anybody in here have any questions, comments, concerns? Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.